Can you believe the history behind the NCAA March Madness tournament? Each and every year in March, fans gather around their TVs to watch one of the most exciting events in sports. Whether you enjoy basketball or not, you know the entertainment value of watching a small market team that's full of spunky players beat some of the big names. We always want to root for the Cinderella story, and it's always fascinating to watch when these teams of small players seemingly beat teams of giants. People get excited each and every year to hope for an upset. Join us as we take a deep dive on the Men's March Madness tournament. The first ever Men's March Madness Division I tournament would take place in 1939. The first ever team to win this tournament would be Oregon, and they would play Ohio State. The first 11 years of the March Madness tournament looked very different than the tournament we know today. The tournament from 1939 to 1950 consisted of only 8 teams. Each of these teams were selected from specific geographical regions and would come from multiple different conferences. Because of this odd requirement, some teams would be left out. Oftentimes, these teams that would be left out would be some of the best in the country. The tournament setup was simple. There would be 4 teams from the East and 4 teams from the West. Each of those teams would come from a specific region and a specific conference from the East or the West. The region issue would come rearing its ugly head in 1950 when the NCAA proposed that Kentucky and NC State have a 1-game playoff to get into the tournament. Kentucky would refuse, believing that as ranked 3rd in the country and NC State ranked 5th, they should have the favor over them. Because of this, the tournament would be changed in 1951, adding another 8 teams and 2 additional districts with 6 at-large tournament spots. Conferences could only have 1 team represent them, but regionally, teams could have multiple representatives in an at-large bid. These changes would allow them to compete with the NIT. They would have great success early on in the 1950s, and by 1953, they would expand the tournament to 22 teams and add a 5th round. Over the next few decades, the tournament would fluctuate between 22 and 25 teams. Between the 1940s and 50s, this tournament would compete head-on with the NIT. They would compete for attendance, they would compete for attention, and they would compete for sponsorship. The NIT was created a year before the NCAA tournament in 1938, and this was created by the Metropolitan Basketball Writers Association. Oftentimes, the tournaments would have a few of the same teams participating. In 1950, the City College of New York would win both tournaments. Soon after this, they would no longer allow teams to participate in both. It would also be at this time the NCAA tournament started to pull away. Specifically, they would start pulling ahead around the 1960s and 70s. The 1970s opened the door for the NCAA March Madness tournament. It would become the predominant college basketball tournament. The NCAA would make its first big rule change regarding the tournaments in 1971. They placed a rule that if a team declined an NCAA tournament bid, they could not participate in the NIT. This rule was created because of Marquette declining their invitation in 1970, which they would then go to the NIT and dominate. Because of this, the NCAA would become the main tournament due to the participation of top seeds and conference champions. The second big rule change that would occur in the 1970s would be to allow multiple NCAA teams per conference into the tournament. This was in response to multiple teams having incredible seasons, even undefeated seasons like that of 1970s South Carolina, who went undefeated but would lose in their conference tournament. This would allow the best of the best teams to participate in the March Madness tournament. It became apparent in the late 1970s and early 1980s that the NCAA was becoming more competitive. The next expansion to the tournament would come in 1975 when they would officially have 32 teams with no byes. In 1979, the tournament would expand more with 40 teams adding a 6th round, but in this format, 24 teams would have byes to the 2nd round. The NCAA would continue to make various different changes with the bye formats into the late 70s and early 80s. During this time period, the NCAA wanted to add more excitement and drama to the tournament by making the seeding and pools different. The purpose of this was to make sure the good teams had simpler schedules to make it to the NCAA championship. By the mid-1980s, we began to see the modern-day NCAA March Madness tournament form. The tournament would expand to 64 teams, eliminating all byes, meaning all teams would have to win 6 games to win the tournament. In the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, media coverage became significantly increased too. This was because sports outlets started to pop up more, and there was a bigger focus on Cinderella stories. Another interesting thing that occurred during the 90s and 80s was a change for bigger sporting venues for the Final Four and championship game. No longer were they just being held in basketball arenas, something that we still see to this day. 2004 brought an interesting rule change for seeding. This was done to prevent number 1 and number 2 seeds overall from facing off before the national championship. Meaning, if everything went according to plan, the number 1 overall seed would face off with the number 4 overall seed in the Final Four, and the number 2 overall seed would face off with the number 3 overall seed in the Final Four, aka number 1 seeds in all the regions facing off with one another. In the mid-2000s, rumors began to swirl that the NCAA was looking to expand the tournament further. As like many sports leagues, they realized the longer the tournament played out, the more revenue they could generate. They began talking about expanding the field significantly in 2010 with as many as 128 teams, but by 2011 they began to seriously look at the field to better understand what they could do. They decided on 96 teams. However, they would sign a major contract with CBS and decide to expand the field only to 68. This expansion led to what we know today as the First Four, which typically pits 16 seeds against each other to see who gets into the tournament, and then also pits at-large bids against each other. Since signing the contract to CBS, the tournaments stayed relatively the same, besides some new naming conventions, marketing, and labeling. The NCAA March Madness tournament has become one of the most exciting sports events. If you've learned nothing over the years, it's the fact that Americans love the underdog. They love rooting for that strange midwestern team who beats Duke or UNC. Before we finish up, let's talk about some of our favorite March Madness upsets in history. The first and most obvious one we have to highlight is the 1985 Villanova Wildcats team that did the impossible. This 8-seed team went on to win the March Madness tournament, being the highest seed ever to win the championship. They were one of the key reasons for the increased media coverage and the obsession with the concept of the Cinderella story during the tournament. Some of our other favorite upsets were when, in 2018, UMBC became the first 16 seed ever to upset the number 1 seed Virginia, winning 74-54. And last year we witnessed the same thing happen again when Fairleigh Dickinson beat Purdue 63-58. Both of these events busted everyone's brackets. 2014 brought the excitement of Shabazz Napier winning it all for UConn as the 7 seed, making them one of the highest teams to ever win the national championship. Some other great upsets were like 2012 when Lehigh beat Duke, or 2013 when Florida Gulf Coast beat Georgetown, and in 2005 when Vermont beat Syracuse. March has always brought excitement and energy for small market teams. As we wrap up, it is important to note the pop culture aspect of March Madness. Whether you're a sports fan or not, there is a great chance that you fill out a tournament bracket every season. Presidents, congressmen, celebrities all fill out brackets. They research bracketology and become engrossed in tournament runs. People with no knowledge of basketball become excited over the sport. The spirit of March Madness is always fun and unmatched. What has been your favorite upset in history? Please let us know in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. Believable Truths.